Welcome to Compliance Therapy with Igor Volovich, presented by Qmulos. Qmulos, converged continuous compliance. Get it together.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Compliance Therapy Podcast. Today, we are very proud and happy to host Jacob Horne. Jacob, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Proud to be here. I'm a big fan of what you guys are starting with this new project.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much. So, welcome again. Why don't you give us a few words about yourself, where you come from, and who do you represent?
Yeah, so my name is Jacob Horne, and I am currently the Chief Cybersecurity Evangelist for a company called Summit 7 Systems. And we are a managed service provider focused specifically on DoD contractors in the defense industrial base. We do all manner of Microsoft technology stack licensing, configuration, migrations into the Microsoft cloud for regulated data within the defense industrial base, which these days is primarily driven by DFARS compliance, CMMC, and a few select NIST standards, which are all sort of related into a fun concoction that I'm sure we'll dissect as we get into things here. So originally from San Diego, California, joined the Navy and moved all around, which exposed me to quite a few domains and disciplines of cybersecurity. And when I got out of the Navy and came back to Southern California, there's a ton of aerospace and defense work out here. And there's a ton of defense acquisition work that's also out here. And very few people are looking to move to Southern California with a clearance who are also familiar with NIST controls and want to work on NIST controls. And I was the guy that decided that would be fun to do. So started working on it, been working in that domain now for several years. And it has sort of slowly evolved into interfacing with DoD contractors, small businesses in the DoD supply chain, as the regulatory pressure from the government to protect their sensitive data has extended from beyond the military and military branches and services into private businesses within the downstream supply chain.
That's a lot.
It's been a journey, that's for sure. It definitely was not what I anticipated when I got into security, which is mostly by chance when I enlisted in the Navy. Definitely not what I thought I was going to be doing. So I've been a SOC analyst. I've worked in blue team assessments, done some cool guy stuff when I was at NSA. Sort of all manner of different disciplines, which is really, really awesome. Opportunity. While I was in, we did, because at the time when I first joined up about 2007. This was before US Cybercom existed. This was before anything had really crystallized. And so as a result, as things started to crystallize, you would get shifted around into lots of different stuff. So we worked in basic malware analysis. We worked on the watch floor. We did, just sort of all of these disciplines as the Navy was trying to figure out where to stick the bodies that they had sent through training. So I got a really big, broad perspective over security as a domain. And with all of that cool sampling that I got to do, I landed in the world of regulatory compliance, which usually makes people scratch their head. But
that's the real cool guy stuff, right? That's
the super cool guy stuff. And I find it interesting because within the domain of security, within the sort of universe of security, it's very underaddressed. It's becoming more and more important. And it's just a very hard problem. And I think that if you look at it as a hard problem, then it's an interesting puzzle. It's an interesting puzzle to solve. There's just a lot of weird elements to compliance and regulation as it interfaces with security and the business that I just find endlessly interesting because nobody has a good answer yet. So it's an evolving domain that I think has just been sort of passed over for a long time.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think as more folks start to realize what compliance actually can deliver in terms of value, not just a thing that you have to do. And I think a lot of us, coming from security backgrounds, look, I spent 20 plus years in security doing, well, as you called it, cool guy stuff, response, forensics, investigations, and kind of moving more into privacy and governance and even some internal investigation functions that kind of took me into different places, right? Different places around the world, different places within the companies, and talking a lot more with lawyers than I did with technologists, and then becoming through this blend of all these skills. So I've kind of have a similar background, minus the military stuff, right? I did fly helicopters, although not in the military.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you in terms of talking to lawyers more and more rather than engineers. Distinctly different types of conversations when you sort of zoom out. And I've started to enjoy the conversations with lawyers more and more over time. I found that sometimes they can be convinced of things, whereas things are a little more black and white on the engineering side. Both advantages and disadvantages, I think. But it's ironic as we get into the conversation here that the thing that really ties them together is the sort of engineering requirements, which I think get kind of buried underneath the term compliance. But this is also informed by the fact that I primarily have worked on NIST controls and environments where NIST controls were the particular flavor of security controls that we worked with, which is a bit of an acquired taste, if you will. Not everybody works with NIST controls directly, but I always sort of say that working with NIST controls is a lot like learning Latin, where it isn't really all that useful in its standard form, but it helps you understand a lot of different languages and sort of get a quick picture of what's going on under the hood. So there's definitely advantages and disadvantages to it.
Well, it's sort of like a lingua franca of compliance, I guess. Once you understand NIST, right? Yeah, I mean, look, you want to go all the way up to NIST 853. That's sort of the big kahuna, right? If you've got that and you can demonstrate compliance all the way through, which I think leads us to another question. What does it mean to have full compliance, right? Because every environment is different. Every enterprise has different compliance needs. And most folks tend to be confused about that. Maybe we can talk about that as well. The mandate comes down from the regulatory authority, and then you try to implement it.
Right. Well,
a lot of folks skip past that first step of, the scoping, the applicability.
Right.
Which controls do you need to select and why?
Yeah,
how do you figure that out, right? So where do you start with that?
Yeah, that has been easily the biggest hurdle within the domain of the DoD supply chain, where I've been working for a few years now, is the standard that is being handed down via the regulations is a standard called NIST 800-171, which is really a heavily tailored or a heavily adjusted, a heavily shortened version of the moderate baseline from 853. So you have the big granddaddy catalog of controls. It's split into smaller blobs, low, medium, and high baseline. And then from there, if you go through the normal process, you can add or subtract controls from those baselines for your particular environment. In a vacuum, that's sort of how it's supposed to work. The government said, well, we hand out this unclassified data that still is sensitive, so it still has protection requirements. And we're going to normalize a minimum standard for the entire government. Doesn't matter what kind of CUI they call it, controlled unclassified information that you get. There's supposed to be a theoretical floor that everyone needs to implement. If there's anything above that is an agency-specific requirement, not our problem. They just wanted to normalize the minimums. Like, you must be this tall to ride the ride, minimum height that you need to meet with your program. So they cut 53 down and they made 171. And they said, because it's a minimum, you have to have all of the controls in place. So within that domain, right, there's very little wiggle room for deciding that to be compliant is to not have everything in place. Now, the sort of big debate over the last few years has been the extent to which companies that have to deal with 800-171 are able to document their missing controls in a plan of action. So the whole debate around CMMC, which is really the program for assessing implementation, has been the fact that a lot of companies will place their controls that they can't get to or don't want to get to for whatever reason in their plan of action, and then they never get to it, right? So they're compliant because they have a plan, but they're not implemented. So you have this like Schrodinger's compliance that has sort of existed for years, and the DoD finally said, enough, we have to show up and verify that everything is in place. Now, that being said, the idea of fully compliant within that domain is actually a knowable idea, in that 800-171, like its big brother 853, have the other side of the coin. They have their assessment procedure twins, and those are in documents called 800-171A and 853A. And that's actually where you take the controls and you break them down into individual elements to check to make sure that the control is implemented, like the actual definition of fully implemented. So a lot of times when people look at 171 or 53 or a generic NIST control, they'll say, okay, sounds great. How do I know if it's implemented? Well, the answer is to go to a different document, which is, in my opinion, bad design, right? It's hard enough to get people to open up a NIST control document, let alone a second one. There's only so much pain that people inflict on themselves. I mean, there's a reason why there's two documents. It has to do with how the government drew out the RMF process for developing systems, but that's still not a very good end scenario where somebody has to look at this document and then this document and back to this document and back to the other one. However, if you look at 171A or 53A, the decomposition of the controls into what they call an assessment procedure gives you the list of things that you would need to have verified in order to know that that control is implemented. And if you have 2 controls or 200 controls or however many controls, you do that same process for every one. And that's how you would know if something were implemented. Now, that's great and all. That's a huge challenge, though. I mean, like I said, this whole debate around CMMC and 171, I still talk to people on a almost weekly basis, and they don't even know that the other document exists. And the big problem is that we've all been attesting to the government and sort of signing, and signing away that we've implemented all these controls. And most people don't know that to know if it's implemented, it's in a document you didn't even know existed. So
challenging, no doubt. It's complex and
unnecessarily challenging. Sometimes it's challenging enough on its own without having to split documents and stuff like that.
So a lot of folks obviously still struggle with it. Well, A, understanding what it is, B, implementing it, and C, demonstrating compliance on some kind of a timeline that actually makes sense from a business perspective. And of course, let's talk about who this primarily affects today and who's kind of in the line of fire when it comes to CMMC.
Yeah. So, as the time of this conversation, everybody right now that's affected by CMMC are folks in the DoD supply chain who receive sensitive information that still needs to be protected. So if you are downstream from the DoD and you are receiving CUI from the DoD, then you have the obligation to implement 800-171. And the DoD is concerned enough over the years that they are going to send assessors under the program called CMMC. So for the last 2 years, there's been a lot of debate and confusion. The way to clarify it is 800-171 are the requirements, the specified controls you have to implement. CMMC is the name of the program that they use to assess your implementation. We could have called it anything. It could be called whatever you want it to be. NIST is just the generic standard for everyone, all the federal agencies. Each federal agency could come up with their own version of CMMC and call it something new. They could all adopt CMMC and use the one that the DoD made. The big takeaway being that the DoD and their supply chain are what I call the canary in the coal mine, in the sense that these CUI data flows are flowing from the government to all kinds of different supply chains and contractors, not just from the DoD. It is just a feature of the fact that the DoD was concerned with this problem about the time that the CUI program was coming online in 2010, that they sort of ran with it before the program was fully implemented. Now, this summer of 2022 is when the big acquisition regulation, that the federal government-wide acquisition regulation is due to be published, which will specify that 800-171 is required for anyone downstream from any federal agency that is receiving this information. And so you can just look to the DoD supply chain, which is primarily small businesses, small defense contractors, small defense manufacturers, and then look to the supply chain downstream from the rest of the federal government, primarily small businesses. Once you get away from the very large contractors into the sub tiers of the supply chain, and 800-171 will cause them the same problems. They don't know that 171A exists. They don't know what it means to be fully implemented. They don't know how it relates to 853 and how to go back to 53 for helpful context to figure out sort of what they meant in the creation of 171. And so, people sort of write off, I think, that whatever the DoD happens to be doing because it's a mess and it's not relevant to them. But it's a useful, it's not an omen, but it's a useful, it's something to pay attention to because it's going to become a problem for many others that are not in the DoD supply chain here in the next few months even.
Do you suffer from seasonal compliance fatigue and chronic compliance headaches? You're not alone. Countless IT, compliance, and cybersecurity professionals just like you continue to suffer from legacy compliance, audit, and assessment workflows, excessive compliance paperwork, and manual evidence collection. Sadly, most have just accepted the idea that compliance management must always be difficult and unpleasant, but it doesn't have to be. Qmulos, an industry leader in converged continuous compliance, has developed revolutionary treatment options to relieve your compliance-related stress, delivering a fully automated end-to-end compliance experience. Don't delay. Call today for a free consultation with one of our compliance therapists and start your journey to converged continuous compliance by Qmulos. Call toll-free 1-844-476-8567 or visit Qmulos.com to start your healing journey. That's Qmulos.com. Qmulos, the compliance automation you need, the compliance experience you'll love.
Well, that's a lot faster than I know a lot of the folks are realizing. And that cascading effect is what you're talking about, kind of the blast radius of compliance, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, for Wendy Nather, I'm a huge fan of an idea that she created about 10 years ago. She called it the cybersecurity poverty line. And she said that if you are a small enough organization, you just don't have the resources to resource a huge, 1% security program, right? You don't have the money for the people or the technologies or the tools or even the licenses for what you need. You don't have the influence over your partners, over your supply chain, over your regulators. There's just all of this stuff that you don't have access to by virtue of your size. And unless you grow to be very large, which most small businesses don't, and that's totally fine, you will never be above that particular line. The problem is that when you get handed regulatory requirements for perfectly reasonable reasons, they don't always jive with the fact that you are below that line. And that gap between where those businesses exist below the poverty line and where the regulations need you to be has to get filled somehow. And what we're seeing in the DoD space is that the government is not very eager to fill it for you. And we're all sort of staring at each other to see what's going to happen, because if they leave it up to industry, there's going to be a lot of businesses that by virtue of their size can't fill that gap. And so we're all waiting to see what's going to happen whenever the other shoe comes down. And it looks like the companies that are paying attention to compliance and trying to understand it might be the ones that are left standing, whereas the ones that sort of assume that the regulation will be downgraded to meet where they are might be left holding the bag.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. And I think there are some implications that kind of go beyond just compliance or risk or security. I think we're talking about smaller companies that do most of innovation also. And
absolutely.
How does that become impacted? And how does our defense supply chain and our defense posture as a country?
Yeah, it's a huge impacted? Yeah, it's a huge trade-off. I mean, so one of the interesting things in my journey of compliance has been that you get the regulation right at the end that sort of specifies in a contract clause that you have to implement 800-171. But there's a whole process that exists known as rulemaking that eventually makes that contract clause show up in black and white. And it's really a fascinating process because most of the government actually runs via the rulemaking or the regulation making process. But most people don't really know how it works. It's very sort of mysterious because it varies from agency to agency. But you can, if you so desire, you can read all of the rulemaking, which is a very useful way of understanding regulations because it's the place where the government documents their reasoning for the regulations. So in this process where they have to publish the proposed regulation and then people can comment on the regulation, the government has to respond to those comments before they make the regulation final. And in the response to those comments, they give their rationale. Now, it's not always all that convincing, and it's probably not all that, it's not always good news for people that are expecting them to be reasonable, but it is insightful. And with the case of 800-171, they have said this repeatedly throughout the rulemaking process since 2013, that they know that regulation causes barriers to entry. They know that it causes more expense for smaller businesses compared to large businesses simply due to economies of scale. Mm-hmm. They know that it causes a outsized cost and burden and impact because they are smaller businesses. They acknowledge that all of those are true. However, in their rationale, the priority is the protection of the information. And so there are trade-offs that have to be made. They originally used to specify full 853 controls pre-2013, and they actually developed 171 with the goal of making it smaller, so there was less to do. However, even 171 itself seems to be too big of a lift for the majority of these companies. And so that's how we got into this stalemate where the government says, listen, we acknowledge that it's going to cause pain to comply, but the ultimate goal here is not the minimization of burden, it is the protection of the data. And this has been a very sort of useful mental model that I've tried to convey to people regarding 800-171 specifically. One of the worst things that they did with CMMC, remember the program that assesses the requirements, is they included the word security in the name of it. And really, this is not a security standard. It is more of a privacy standard because 800-171 is concerned with a very specific subset of data, and it is only tailored down to a very narrow set of controls that are designed to protect the confidentiality of that data. It is not designed to start a security program from scratch. It is not a CISO in a book. It is not designed to ensure the integrity or availability of your operations or your other data flows or any of the things that you would want to take into consideration. It is only concerned with a very narrow mandate that the government was given to protect the confidentiality of this data. And ironically, they picked that as the paradigm because most of the data that the government deals with is privacy data. It's personal health information. It's personally identifiable information. There's all these edge cases like in the DoD where almost none of that data is privacy information, but you're left with that model that was designed that way. So when they pick it up, when most people pick it up, they go, oh, well, it's security. Security is a risk management function. And so therefore, I can apply my own risk determinations and analysis to determine what I'm going to implement and what I'm not going to implement. And that's not how that works. You are a data steward and the government is the data owner, which means they write the rules. And if you don't comply with those rules, you don't get to ride the ride. The twist of the knife being is that this is all retroactive. The DoD and the government, didn't adopt that stance in anything more than writing over the years. And so now you have entire businesses where 100% of their revenue is derived from working with this particular data stream. And they are a small business and they can't meet the minimum burden of 171. So that's why we have this huge problem on our hands in the DoD. It's actually really, it's an amazing, it's tragic, but it's an amazing story to see how, otherwise reasonable, minimized standards that tried to not overstep the bounds, not tell you how to run your program, like almost purposely to not be bureaucratic and to get out of the way, set a standard in motion where people now equate a very narrow standard with security. And then they start to beat up on the standard, and they go, well, "This isn't a very good standard." Well, you're imagining that standard is something that it's not, right?
This is very revelatory, and I think our audience needs to kind of pay attention to what you just said. I think that's a very clear distinction that needs to be made. CMMC is the program, 800.171 is the standard, and these are the controls that you have to comply with. And I think folks have become really accustomed to this idea of wiggle room in compliance, where there's always room for negotiation. Back all the way to the days of PCI DSS, there's always a negotiation with the auditors and assessors. And, you put compensating controls in place and you rate the overall risk model. And you'd say, okay, well, we might not be able to implement a particular control, but we've got other things that we can put in place around it. And it will create that compensating model. That's not the case anymore. Not when it comes to CMMC.
Mostly, so it's mostly correct. But this is another very interesting piece, and this is not to beat up on the companies that got handed this standard, right? That's sort of the easy thing to do. This is 100% the fault of the DoD and the government being extremely bad at explaining what they want, right? I mean, they just have done almost nothing to try to make it clear to explain what they want. Like, people should not be reading me on LinkedIn to explain these things. These are the basics that the government should be putting out, like in a tweet or something, but they just don't. So there is a mechanism via DFARS, which is the contract clause that specifies the requirements in 171, which CMMC, the program, assesses. There is a line in the clause that people can find in their contracts that says, if you can't implement one of these controls in the minimum standard of 110 things, then you can do compensating controls. However, it is not your decision about whether they are sufficiently compensatory. It is the DoD CIO's decision, because it's not your data, which means it's not your risk decision. It's their risk decision. And the biggest thing that is happening is exactly what you said. People go, well, for various reasons, we can't implement this specific control. So we're going to mark it not applicable, or we're going to mark it as compensating controls with some other collection of things. And they miss the step where they have to go back and verify that that is an acceptable solution. And what's happening is people are starting to see mock assessments or sort of precursor information gathering, unofficial assessments. And they'll say, well, we have this compensation in place. And people go, according to who? According to you? I mean, that's great, but this is not a you problem. This is a DoD CIO problem. And you signed the contract that said that you agree to steward this data appropriately. Now, that being said, that no one likes to hear that. I mean, you can point it out in black and white all day long, but this is the way that it's supposed to work. You know what people really don't like is when you point out some line in a contract clause somewhere and you go, see, gotcha. Everything you thought was incorrect. So there is a proper way to do it. And I think when you explain it to people conceptually, they get it. But like I said, the regulators are just doing no one any favors. And as a result, it compounds this larger idea that has grown over the years that compliance is an inherent problem. There's nothing inherently wrong with compliance. It's typically how it's executed, how it's understood. There's all these things that fall short, that don't do it. Don't give it its just dues. And then it becomes an easy excuse, where the point where I'm sure you've seen it is compliance almost becomes an epithet, right? Where they go, oh, it's compliance. It's compliance. You go, I don't, it's fascinating to watch, because you tell people, and I'm sure you've seen this as you've spun up the podcast. You're like, we're gonna do a podcast on compliance. And they go, ugh, why would you do that? And you go, well, are you saying that there's something inherently wrong with the nature of complying with the regulations? Is there something wrong with the regulations themselves? Maybe. Is there something wrong with knowing? Is there something wrong with, it gets to this sort of larger discussion. Personally, I think that something that's contributed to it is that within the realm of cybersecurity, like as vast as that world is, one of the things that we've stopped saying is information assurance. So information assurance as a distinct discipline has almost completely faded from the common lexicon of cybersecurity. And if you go way back into ancient NIST documents, right? We're going to do a little archaeology here. if you go way, way back into the originating versions of 853, I'm talking back in like 2004, 2006 timeframe, they go on at length that a security control consists of two parts. One is functionality, one is assurance. And various controls are more functionality, they're more assurance, but they all generally have two sides to them. And you need both of them, because if you just implement a bunch of functionality and you have no assurances that the functionality is working or working properly or doing what it needs to be doing, then what are you doing? And if you are just trying to gain assurance without corresponding functionality, then it's all theater. And by losing that connection between those two things, I think we're just so heavily biased towards functionality that we're starting to see the world try to grapple with, how do I know what I'm spending my money on? How do I know that it's actually implemented? How do I have any assurance that my investment is giving me business value? I mean, the security community, we flog ourselves about this endlessly. How do we frame it in the context of the business? So, I mean, the first step to that is having some assurance that it's even working, right? Now, if you sort of zoom out and put yourself in a privacy standard or maybe something like 800-171, the government is seeking assurance that you are able to protect the data. CMMC being the program that is designed to send an assessor and gain some level of assurance to report back to them that, yeah, we actually can do this. But you can see this in the insurance industry. You can see this with the SEC rules that are being created now. Everyone's grappling for assurance.